This story takes place 3 months ago at a karaoke bar. My boyfriend's older sister Angie and I went out for the first time together, and we went to this bar that hosts a karaoke night every Friday night. She had a guy friend named Paul who met us there, who had a crush on her, and he bought us drinks the entire night. We were having a good time. It was like 2 a.m. and we were sitting outside because both Paul and Angie smoke but I don't. But because I didn't want to stay in there alone or anything, I went with her. We found a wooden table with a bench-like seats, and 2 of them sat on one side of the table, and I was on the other side by myself talking with them. Some random guy, Pete, was behind me, standing like 3 feet away, leaning on the wall, but like he was close enough that I could see him if I moved my eyes to the left a little bit. Angie is very outgoing, and so, as we were talking, she ended up asking him some questions. I can't remember what she asked because I wasn't paying attention to them, but rather the people who were talking around us. But he ended up responding and slowly was approaching my side of the table. And once he got to my side, he sat down beside me, at which I already started to get a weird vibe from him. I was talking to Angie about something, and when I stopped, Pete started asking where I was from, since it was clear I am not from England, since I don't have a British accent. I told him that I'm from Canada, and he told me he works for immigration at the airport, and to which I said, "Oh, nice," not showing much interest. He asked what I could possibly be doing here, and I replied by telling him that I was here visiting my boyfriend. Angie was even talking about how she was here with her brother's girlfriend, me, to other people that she was having conversations with. Pete had both his arms resting on the table, one of his hands holding his glass of whatever he was drinking that night, and then he moved the hand that was closest to me and put it on his lap. But being that I'm a very observant person, I noticed this and was starting to feel really uncomfortable. As Angie and Paul were talking about stuff with the other people who were outside, because my hand was resting on my lap, he moved over on the bench to be closer to me and reached for my hand and held it, but really firmly and hard. I quickly pulled it away and moved myself over a bit on the wooden bench and put my hand that he just held on the table and held onto my drink. He put it back in his lap, and within a few minutes later, he was reaching under the table again, but this time he grabbed my knee and held it. I pushed the hand away and repeated, "I have a boyfriend," to him, and even Angie was like, "Dude, she has a boyfriend, in case you didn't hear the first 3 times we said it." And so we carry on outside for the next hour, and when it gets to 3 a.m. when the bar closes, Angie and I were going to go back home, but she decided she wanted to hang out at Paul's house for a bit and drink more there and stuff, and so I agreed. But all of a sudden, Pete asked, "Oh well, can I come with you? I'm only here for tonight and I'll go back to where I live tomorrow." And Angie said, "I mean, it's not my house, but if my friend is fine with it, then sure." So Paul allowed him to come along to his place with us. Angie called an Uber to get us to Paul's house. While we waited at the table for the Uber, Pete said, "We can go back to my hotel room and wait for an Uber. I'm staying right here." The bar was a part of the hotel. So Angie, of course, agreed, but I didn't like the idea that much because he kept saying how pretty we look the entire time we were going to his hotel, and plus, I didn't know how to get home myself since I had no idea even where I was, so I just followed them. We get in the room and we wait 10 minutes for the Uber. The whole time, Pete is full on staring at us, smirking, and for God knows whatever the reason was. We eventually got to her friend's house. Pete is flirting with me and even rubbed my leg again when I was sitting on the floor because I wasn't feeling too good. Skip to when we all leave. Pete tells us that he was going to book an Uber for himself, so naturally, Angie and I book a separate Uber to get home. But I ended up glancing down at his phone when he was booking the Uber, and he never actually booked a ride. He was just chilling on the app, acting like he was. I thought this was weird. So 15 minutes later, our Uber is outside. It's like 5 a.m. now. Pete was like, "Hey, can I just hop in there with you two?" And Angie replied kind of hesitantly like, okay. But I thought your Uber was on its way though. And he was like, I don't know. But with the weirdest tone in his voice. So he has a smoke outside of the car. He smokes as well before getting in. Her and I are in the car with the driver. And that's when I tell her that he never actually booked a ride for himself. We both looked at each other in confusion for a second, and you could tell that now she was seeming to be a bit more cautious with what she was doing or saying with him. So the plan was, the Uber was going to drop us two off first and then take him to wherever he was going. So because of this, she asked the driver to take us to the road before the one with our house on it, because she didn't want him to know where we lived because now she didn't really trust him. Pete finally gets into the car. I'm on the right side and she is in the middle, and he gets in on the left. The whole time, I can hear him trying to flirt with her and saying some stuff like, "You wanna hook up?" And then at one point he was like, "She can join in too." And she kept saying no a bunch of times to him. I was looking out the window because I didn't want to look at him at all. But when he said that, I gave him a weird look. But I don't think he really paid any attention to it. I looked back out of my window, and this is when it got a lot more weird and creepy. He kept saying that he was coming home with us, and not going back to wherever he was going. He was not letting up on coming home with us. Angie told him that we were walking home after a certain point because she didn't have the money to pay for the whole ride, which obviously was a lie. And he was like, "That's okay, I'll just follow you home, and we can have a good time." So finally, after like 10 minutes of this, she was like, "Can you pull over?" to the driver. And he was very confused by this, probably because he never got asked this, and said, and she was like, "Please, pull over now." And so we did. Pete started to wonder why she was doing this and asked, "What are you doing, babe?" And she was like, "I told you, you aren't coming back with us. Get out." At this time, I was looking at him directly. She was getting angry because he wasn't getting out of the car. She started raising her voice and was like, "We aren't moving until you get the heck out of this car and call yourself a different Uber." Pete started to get kind of serious now and was like, "Why? What did I do? I'm sorry." And she just replied, "Leave." To that, he told her that he was only leaving if she gave him her number, and she refused. And then he told us that he wasn't leaving the car until she did so. So she said fine and took his phone, put in some random number she thought of it, and gave it back to him. He was still trying to convince her to let him stay with us, but she wasn't having any of it and told him goodbye. He got out of the car finally and she slammed his door shut and told the Uber to get away from there and to take us home. I was worried the next time I went to that bar because Pete would be there, but I haven't seen him since this situation. I always wondered what would have happened if Angie wasn't as outgoing as she was and kicked him out of the car. I think we would have been in some serious trouble. Okay, so first off, this happened a few months ago. I had just moved into an apartment complex and had only a bed, a TV, a rocking chair, and an Xbox One. I work in a town that is an hour away and they didn't have anything available that I could move into. So this big city was the next closest place that was also in my price range. The first few weeks play out the same. I get up, shower, go to work for 10 hours and come home, eat, watch a little Netflix, and go to sleep and repeat. On my days off, I travel 3 hours away to see my wife and kids. Now we aren't divorced or separated. I had to relocate from the town we lived in to start my career in asset protection, as an asset protection manager. One night, as I was going through my evening routine, someone knocks on my door. It's a woman, maybe 5'7" with brown hair, and she's skinny. She looked like she was methed out of her skull. Her eyes were barely even open. She asked to talk to somebody named Jareth. I told her no one by that name lived here, and she said that he did. She said that she was here last Thursday and he was here. She wanted to buy drugs from him, and this was the address she was given. I once again told her that no one was named Jareth and they lived here, and I shut the door on her. She started banging on the door, crying how she needed her fix. I told her to get lost. After a few moments, I heard someone yell at her to shut up, or that they were calling the cops. The banging stopped and I never saw her again. I sat back down and continued watching the movie that I had on. I started thinking about what the woman had said. She couldn't have been here last Thursday. I was off work last Thursday and Friday with my wife and children. I started to look around more closely. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked all the windows. Nothing was cracked or broken. All these security bars were locked in their places. There were no upper attic spaces, nor crawl spaces, and nothing. I felt a little more secure and went about my night as usual. My next days off, I made sure everything was locked and nothing was out of place. And I went to see my wife as usual. I told her about what had happened. She suggested that I take the pellet gun. Now I know, what is a pellet gun going to do? Well, then her thinking, it looked like a real gun. In the dark, no one can really tell the difference. And same for at a distance. Plus it had a CO2 cartridge in it and 10 pellets. So I took it. When I got back, I looked around. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was missing. I put my stuff up as usual and I turned on my Xbox. This is where I noticed something was off. When it powers on, it takes you to the home screen. But on this screen, you can see the last thing you were on plus the previous things you have done. When I left last the Netflix app, it should have been the first one on there, but it wasn't. Instead, it was Battlefield 1. From before that, it was Mortal Kombat. Someone had been using my Xbox. I once again did a thorough search of the apartment. Nothing. It was a couple of days after that the guy across from me approached me while I was getting out of my vehicle. He said that a lot of people were coming by the apartment on certain nights, and they were making a lot of noise and it keeps his daughter up, and if I could keep it down or just stop doing whatever it was that I was doing on those nights. I was confused. I must have shown it because his expression changed. He asked me if I was the one who was having people over at odd hours of the night. I told him no. I proceeded to tell him the things that were happening. I told him that I'm 200 miles away on my days off, and we both came to the conclusion that someone was getting into my apartment when I wasn't there. I made the decision not to go see my family 1 week to see if the person using my apartment would show up. Of course, no one came that week or the week after. It dawned on me at work one day during a conversation about how shoplifters would try to see what vehicle you drove, to know if you were there, that it hit me. Whoever was using my apartment knew what I drove. With that in mind, I waited until my next days off to set my trap. On the same day, I parked my vehicle 3 complexes down and walked back. I unscrewed all of my light bulbs and waited in the corner in the living room. I had to let my neighbor know what I was doing in case any trouble occurred. I put my phone to its lowest brightness and had my camera ready, flash and all. I waited for 6 hours, which felt like forever, before it happened. I heard the front door knob jiggle. I got up, phone in one hand and pellet gun in the other. The door opened and someone entered, shutting it behind them. And then I heard it click and then another. They were trying to switch on the lights. I then saw a light from the doorway. They had their phone out and they were making their way into the room that I was in. As soon as they entered the doorway, I snapped a picture. The brightness of the flash caught him completely off guard. He was momentarily stunned, cursing at me, trying to make his way back to the front door. I yelled at him to get out and to never return. He had reached into his pocket, dropping something as he pulled out a small pocket knife. I immediately raised the pellet gun and cocked the hammer. That stopped him completely. He dropped the knife, opened the door, and ran out. My neighbor, who had heard me yelling, was waiting outside of his place when the man ran out. He saw me run out of my apartment, gun and all, and asked if I had shot him. I told him no, that it was a pellet gun, but the man didn't know. I went back to the door and retrieved the pocket knife and what he had dropped. It was a key to my door. I don't know how he got it, but he had it. I showed the picture to my neighbor, and he thought that he had recognized him, but he wasn't sure. I stayed up late that night, calling my wife and telling her what had happened. The next day, I went over to the complex office and told them what had happened. I brought up the fact that he had a key to my door and I wanted to know why he did. They weren't sure, and then I showed them the picture of the man. They knew right then and there how he had a key. Turns out the person who was going into my apartment complex was a maintenance worker for them. He had been one of the ones renovating my apartment before I had moved in. They were giving keys and he must have made a copy of one. Then for nights at a time he would use it to do whatever it was he did. I must have put a hamper in his nightly business when I moved in. That is, until he figured out my routine. The man was, of course, fired from his job and prohibited from entering the grounds again, and I was given 3 months of free rent. I never pressed charges and I let it go. I have a real gun, just in case now. My neighbor and I struck up a friendship and we now watch each other's places when we are out of town. Hopefully, this never happens again to anyone else. And yes, I had the locks changed in case you were wondering. I live in a small rural community in the eastern US. It's a nice little town. Because of my work in the medical field, I met some interesting folks. I'm also familiar with law enforcement and emergency personnel. Small town life is not as dull and uneventful as people think, especially since everybody knows somebody who knows somebody. I have a lot of stories to share, but this one just happened, so I'll start here. Because it's still very recent and the investigation is ongoing, I have to be vague in some details, but I needed to tell someone. I'm single and I live alone. Due to a stalker, I moved twice, but that's another story for another time. However, it is relevant for this story for multiple reasons. The first reason being that I have a dog for the sake of protection, as well as have motion sensors and outdoor security cameras. The second reason being the location of my home, which is literally down the street from the fire department. I can see it from my living room window, and a couple of blocks from the police station. However, next to the fire department is the road department, which is basically a parking lot where they park their road equipment and empty garbage trucks at night on the weekends. Oddly, it doesn't have any security cameras. Small town life, I suppose. My house sits on a hill with a good view of that side of the street. Due to the incline, the large trees in the front yard, and the half cornfield on my property next to me, most people on the street below wouldn't notice me in the backyard unless they were actively looking. However, I can see the street clearly. This incident happened Saturday evening. The county was holding its annual Independence Day spiel with a community barbecue, music, fireworks, and everything. I didn't attend because it was just not my thing. Plus, I have a dog and the sounds of fireworks could be traumatizing. Before the big show, I took the dog out to relieve herself in the backyard. There was still at least an hour of daylight, but the entire neighborhood was pretty quiet, because mostly everyone was at the fairgrounds or other various holiday events. So when an unfamiliar, large white pickup drove slowly down the street, I noticed. It must have turned around at the end of the street because I saw it again, move it in the opposite direction, only about 20 seconds later. This time, it turned into the parking lot of the road department. Now people have been known to toss things into the empty garbage trucks, usually at night to avoid getting caught, because they don't want to or are unable to make the trip to the landfill themselves. Usually it's things like furniture or broken equipment, but I didn't see any of those things in the back of this truck. The driver was a somewhat stocky guy of average height. He took 3 large black trash bags from the bed of his truck and tossed them one by one into the hopper of the garbage truck, and then he left. And now I swear I'm not one of those meddling rear window types who always thinks activity is suspicious and that their neighbors are up to no good, but something about this didn't sit right with me. Normally, when I see people tossing their garbage into the trucks and leaving, I don't bother reporting it because it's relatively harmless. But this time, I had a gut feeling, and so I called the police. If anything, they could get the guy for illegally dumping trash from a barbecue or whatever. While I'm on the phone with dispatch, I put my dog inside to cut down on distractions while the officers investigate. A few minutes later, An officer arrived and I crossed the street to meet him, gave him a description of the events, and pointed out which of the trucks the man had tossed the bags. He found the bags and he took photos. He put on gloves and told me to stay back. The bags were tied in a knot at the top and it took him a minute to untie one because of the gloves and how tight the knot was, but eventually he got it open, looked inside for a few seconds and then twisted it closed and took a few steps back. Holy crap, he hissed under his breath. What? It's a body. I felt sick, and I could tell that he did too. I saw him grow pale, his hand was trembling when he held the radio. Even his voice was shaking as he gave the code to dispatch. The dispatcher sounded confused when she asked him to repeat it. Within 10 minutes, the county sheriff was on the scene. He even looked sick at the contents of the bag. The coroner arrived about 10 minutes after that, and the first officer walked me back to the house along with another one, who arrived at the same time. Though I showed the first cop via the app on my phone when I described the events initially, I now showed them the video on a larger screen. The camera caught footage of the truck as it drove by both times as well as pulling into the parking lot, though unfortunately not a clear view of the license plate or of the man tossing the bags out of frame. We watched the footage over and over, pausing frames and the officers taking notes. Ultimately, they requested this footage as well as a copy of the files from the past week, to see if the truck had been in the area before. I've also been saving footage until the road department installs their own camera this week. Because this is still fresh, I don't know how many more details. I know the body was in pieces, but I don't know the age of the victim, the gender, or the cause of death. The information hasn't been released to the public. I don't know if they've been able to identify the body yet either. A police cruiser has been parked at the fire department next door for constant surveillance in case the guy decides to come back. The guy who did this was likely a local. How else would he know to dump it here? He probably thought it would get buried in other people's illegal trash accumulated over the holiday weekend, and the sanitation crew wouldn't have bothered to investigate. When I think about how this guy lives in my community, it makes me feel physically ill. To think that he had clearly scouted the area for a dump site, that it may not have been the first time this had happened, and that this could happen again. If I hadn't have called it in, if I hadn't been in the backyard at that exact moment, or if I had ignored that gut feeling, the victim would have never been found, may never find potential justice, and their loved ones may never have closure. In fact, there's a possibility that it just might happen again to another poor soul. I hope it's not me. Dear God, please don't let it be me. I think it's time that I moved again. Third time's a charm, right?